Okay. So starting from left to right, or, well, yes, right to left. Rosanne Currarino, Associate Professor of History at Queen's University in Ontario, where she teaches and researches the economic, intellectual, and cultural history of 19th century America. Her first book, The Labor Question in America, Economic Democracy in the Gilded Age, examined various efforts to redefine the parameters of democratic participation in industrial America. The Journal of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, our co-hosts today, describe it as, quote, a nuanced, deeply informed reading of the complex intellectual and cultural currents that shaped the labor question in the late 19th century. Quite simply, a marvelous, informative book. Her new book project, Orange Grove Capitalism, Imagining the Modern American Economy, looks at Southern California's early orange growers, the men and women who eventually formed Sunkist, in order to reconsider how we understand the incorporation of America during the Gilded Age. That research has been supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and previewed in the Journal of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Professor Currarino's other work has appeared in the Journal of American History, Journal of the Civil War Era, and Labor History. Suresh Naidu, we're going out of order here, I'm sorry. Suresh Naidu teaches economics, political economy, and development at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, where he is associate professor. He earned a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley in 2008, and has previously served as a visiting assistant professor at MIT and a Harvard Academy postdoctoral fellow. His research has covered a notably wide range of topics and periods in economic history, from monopsony in today's digital labor markets to slavery wealth in Civil War Maryland. He is currently working on something like a dozen articles that similarly cover a broad range of array of interests and serves as a referee for more journals in the profession than, frankly, I really cared to count. Devin Fergus, seated at the rightmost, is Distinguished Professor of History and Black Studies at the University of Missouri, where his research focuses on political economy, policy, and inequality in modern America. He has published widely on such matters in public venues like the New York Times, Washington Post, and The Guardian, and has likewise worked closely with numerous national policy organizations like Demos and Prosperity Now towards the amelioration of inequality, in addition to presenting his research to many federal entities, including the U.S. Treasury, U.S. Department of Education, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He's the author most recently of Land of the Fee, which explores the hidden costs of rising financial fees at home, school, work, and transportation on wealth and mobility in modern America. He serves as well as the editor of the Columbia University Press Series on the history of U.S. capitalism and is currently writing a book examining white-collar crime and the racial wealth gap. Paul Krugman is Distinguished Professor of Economics here at the Graduate Center, where he arrived in 2016 from a university I won't name. The author or editor of 27 books and more than 200 articles in professional journals and edited volumes, he is among the most influential economists in the world, known for his work on international trade and finance, economic geography, liquidity traps, and currency crises. In 2008, the Nobel Committee awarded him their famous prize for his contributions to new trade theory and new economic geography. And in 2011, I learned from Wikipedia, he was named in a survey of his peers, favorite living economist under 60. Many of you probably know him better as the best columnist at the New York Times, where since 1999, he's published hundreds of op-eds commenting on a wide range of economic and political issues. He's also the author of non-academic bestsellers, such as The Return of Depression Economics and The Conscience of a Liberal, based on his digital journal, ranked in 2011 one of the 25 best financial blogs by Time magazine. You can catch him on Twitter, along with his other 5 million followers. Last and certainly not least, our moderator for the panel, Janet Gornick, professor of both political science and sociology here at the Graduate Center as well as director of the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. Since 2016, Professor Gornick has served as director of the U.S. Office of LIS, formerly the Luxembourg Income Study, a cross-national data archive and research center located in Luxembourg, which has a satellite office here at the Graduate Center. For 10 years previous, she served as LIS's general director, and most of her own research, naturally, is internationally comparative too, dealing with the impact of social welfare policies on gender disparities in the labor market and with regards to income. She is published in all the leading journals of the field, as well as popular venues like Challenge, The American Prospect, and Dissent. Her research has likewise been supported by everyone from Russell Sage and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to the Department of Health and Human Services and Social Security Administration, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Bank. She sits on the advisory board or editorial board of no less than 7 professional journals and has co-authored and edited several works, including most recently Income Inequality, Economic Disparities, and the Middle Class in Affluent Countries. So please join me in welcoming our panels today.
I'm actually going to stay here at the podium so I can see the panelists. So I hope that's not a problem for the live stream. If it is, tell me and I will move. Let me tell you all what we're going to do, moving rather briskly. So we're going to start by having each of our 4 panelists make an opening remark for about 2 minutes. I'll come back to that in just a moment, just to sort of set the stage and allow them all to get some initial thoughts on the table. And then I'm going to stand, I guess, and ask them some questions. We've had quite a lot of discussion in advance. So we're going to talk, of course, our main topic are the economic drivers of the first and second Gilded Ages, so to speak. But we're also going to talk about the interaction of the economic drivers and some important social dislocations of the 2 periods. And then we're going to open to Q&A. I think we've started with the idea of email, but we're a little concerned about connectivity, so we now have mics in the aisles, and we'll invite people to, for the last 30 minutes, I'll be sure to start that on time. We'll invite people to go up to the mics and address questions to the panelists. Just 2 quick things to say, and the marvelous keynote speaker, Steve Fraser, addressed this. I just wanted to mention that as we were talking among ourselves, the question came up of the periodization. The second periodization, not so complicated, but the first one, obviously, historians have talked for many years about the question of what years bounded the first Gilded Age, and there's a great diversity of views. Some date it starting from about the middle 1860s, others the middle or even later 1870s. And then the historical literature, as we just heard, it's the closing period of the first Gilded Age is sometimes described as the turn of the century, sometimes the late teens, the entrance into World War I, and sometimes as late as 1929. We decided to sort of leave the question aside just so we wouldn't get sidetracked, because it is in itself, as our speaker said, an irresistible question. But that said, of course, I've been inviting the panelists to, as they wish, to talk about whatever periods of time their argument strays into. If we stray into the first 3 decades of the 20th century, that's the panelists are free to set the period as they wish. So let me ask each of you. I'm going to go in the order of the program, Suresh, and then Paul and Devin and Rosanne, just to make as I said, about 2 minutes of commentary. So let me just remind you all, the audience probably has seen all this, but I want you to draw on the question as the whole panel was framed. As we think about these 2 periods, both characterized, of course, by high levels of economic inequality, we know that the market forces shaping inequality in the 2 periods are not so easily compared. So considering the differences between the domestic and the global economy of the late industrial period and today, does it make sense to draw these parallels? How should we identify and contrast the economic and especially the market-based drivers of high and rising inequality in each period to answer the question, in fact, are we in a second Gilded Age? So let me ask you, Suresh, to kick that off.
Okay, thanks a lot for having me. So I actually think about it as an sort of as an economic historian. What I find most interesting about thinking about the Gilded Age is not so much for this sort of, it rhymes with our, I can talk about it. There we go. So what I find really interesting is actually taking the Gilded Age as some conservatives like to think of it as like, this is when we actually had laissez-faire. And that this is when the government was like not involved in regulation. It was before the rise of the administrative state. It was before the rise of the federal taxation system. It was, you know, kind of the period that in a lot of ways, economic conservatives think of, you know, that's kind of the period where we had a lot of economic growth and, you know, the government stayed out of the economy. And so what I find interesting is thinking about exactly what did that look like, and did it look anything like what people say laissez-faire is going to look like. And when I look at the 19th century through that lens, I sort of find that, you know, it looks nothing like the kind of smooth functioning of markets that you'd kind of expect, that sort of some economists kind of think that would kind of naturally emerge when in the period where you don't have a lot of government intervention. Instead, you have kind of labor markets that are like super frictional. You have strikes. You have conflict. You have tons of violence. And a whole bunch of things just don't actually work very well until kind of you get the expansion of the administrative state into lots and lots of realms of the economy, and we can and we sort of improve things in the late 19th century, early 20th century with kind of all of these progressive reforms, which are double-edged in very interesting ways. They're like both kind of really big improvements in public goods. They're also lots of ways of you know, eliminating the franchise in the South was part of that wave of progressive reform. So I guess I want to think of it not so much as, oh, they're just periods of high inequality, but actually the underlying institutions are so different that they give us a useful window into kind of the counterfactual of what would happen if you did in fact move in a more economically conservative direction, policy-wise, and it's not pretty.
Okay, actually, I'm going to change a little bit what I was going to say, because I think Suresh made an excellent point. But let me just, you know, first of all, obviously, comparing, contrasting, looking for parallels, it would be pretty stupid not to do that, right? You have two eras of high economic inequality, which, as distinct from previous eras of high economic inequality, were not based upon the dominance of a landed aristocracy, but were based somehow or other on market incomes earned in a increasingly non-agricultural economy. And the principles of economics change slowly. It would be surprising if we didn't find that there were some important commonalities, but also some important differences. And I think actually, so I want to pick up on Suresh, which is that, look, everybody in contemporary debates about policy uses the Gilded Age as a reference point. It's just how they see it differs. That we have, for people on the left, the Gilded Age is a cautionary tale about a highly unequal society and the bad things that happen when you have when you don't have equalizing institutions. For people on the right, and this has been true for a long, long time, you know, whatever your definition, but the period between the Civil War and World War I, let's say, or maybe even after that, is seen as an exemplary period, a demonstration of the wonderful things that a market economy can accomplish. It's relevant, you know, literally to today's headlines. We currently have the President of the United States nominating advocates of the gold standard to the Federal Reserve Board, and the belief that the gold standard is a wonderful thing or not depends crucially on your interpretation of the Gilded Age.
Devin?
Okay, sure. So maybe because I'm sort of married to an English professor, I have a sort of close reading of some of the language here. And so I think it talked about this as a crisis. And I sort of take exception maybe, or at least want to walk us off that ledge, walk us back a little bit. I'm actually an expat now living in the UK for a year or more. And so far as I know, there's no Gilded Age survival kit, like the Brexit survival kit, which 30 days of ration food and filtered water, and there's no plan for the president to have an escape route like the plan for the Queen to have an escape route. And so to sort of walk us off that ledge a little bit, that maybe it's not the crisis that we think it might be. That's not to say that a crisis isn't looming on the horizon. And I think for me, one of the distinctions between the first and second Gilded Age is the population who's going to be targeted in part for this crisis. And that's what I see as a process of wealth extraction. And so I agree with my panelists said before, the first Gilded Age was a lot about extractive economies, but of natural resources. Today's Gilded Age is about extractive financial resources, particularly from financial predation from historically vulnerable populations. And these historically vulnerable populations are not simply have a history of being targeted populations, but they're also the fastest growing populations in the US. And Brookings came out with a report last year that by 2043, plurality of the middle class of Americans will be people of color. And that's also historically populations that have been targeted for financial predation. And so my great concern and fear moving forward is that what's going to happen to this population, not simply for the sake of wealth extraction of that community, but because it's going to be the plurality of the middle class, how will we fund entitlement programs, infrastructure, and defense, since the middle class is so central to funding those projects and programs, frankly? And also, what about issues of consumer spending, since the middle class is so central as an engine, a driver of consumer spending? And so, good news is, I don't think we're necessarily in crisis. When I go back to the UK, I may not be accessing my bank account. That's a crisis. I'm stockpiling toilet paper. That's a crisis. But I also worry that what's going to happen in the next decade or two to come, as we have this extractive economy focused on communities of color who will be a plurality of the middle class by mid-century.
Rosanne?
So as a historian, very much a historian in the first Gilded Age, I'll stick my comments to that more or less. One of the things that historians...
Pick up your mic.
Oh, am I not loud enough? Oh, see now, up here we boom. So I don't know what it sounds like there. When we say second Gilded Age, at least on the center on the left, today it's a useful shorthand for staggering economic inequality, but it also, I think, refers to, or it makes it seem like the market forces and the drivers of inequality are overwhelming. There's almost nothing we can do about dynastic wealth, overpaid executives, freewheeling corporations, or irresponsible financial firms. It's a kind of static fatalism at work in the term second Gilded Age. But if we look at the first Gilded Age, we're reminded that there's a history to market forces, that they change over time, and they are themselves historical. So I want to make two very quick points about the first Gilded Age that maybe are useful to think about now. First, the Gilded Age was not static. It was dynamic. It was a moment of transition from proprietary competitive capitalism to corporate capitalism, and how people understood that transformation meant they also understood equality very different. The beginning of the period and at the end of the period. At the start of the 19th century, equality tended to mean the possibility of owning property, of being your own boss. By the end of the 19th century, Steve Fraser put this in the 30s, I think it's a little earlier, equality tended to mean the capacity to enjoy the abundance of industrial life, of having access to good things, or as AFL leader Samuel Gompers put it, of having more. Second, late 19th century Americans, and I mean all kinds of people you don't usually put together, were not fatalistic. They acted to make it possible for more Americans to enjoy that more. All sorts of things. Jane Addams' Hull House, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, the Pure Food and Drug Act, prosecution of Standard Oil, building urban playgrounds, all are part of the Gilded Age, along with inequality. Today, when we say Gilded Age, we forget about these reformers, I think, about what historians sometimes call the progressive era. Sure, the Gilded Age witnessed economic inequalities, but it also produced widespread cross-class efforts to minimize those inequalities. And I think the first Gilded Age then maybe reminds us that market forces, capitalism, equality are historically created. They change, they are not absolute forces. They are, as Eric Auerbach put it, a piece of history.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone there. I'm going to open up now, or start the panel discussion. I've got some questions that are tailored for each of you, and I'm going to direct about 2 questions to each of you, but I want to invite you to jump in and react as you wish to our colleagues here. Suresh, let me start with you. We're talking about market forces here in these 2 periods, but obviously markets are embedded in states. My question for you is, the US government today is obviously larger and more redistributive, and actually in your words, putatively more democratic than it was during the first Gilded Age. What are the implications of that observation for this analogy between the first and second? Does it make this analogy problematic?
Yeah, so I think it's got to be that the way in which conflict over inequality looks is just going to be different in a world where, you know, more women and minorities have the right to vote in a way that they didn't in the late 19th century, where the main policy instruments available to the federal government are basically what gold is what standard of currency to use and the tariff. So there's no sort of like talk about using the federal tax code to do redistribution in the late 19th centuries. There's no talk about a federal minimum wage and no talk about, you know, very much in the way of like federal labor law. So there's just not the sort of same scope for the federal government to intervene, which is why I think so much of the conflict in over redistribution in the late 19th century looks so violent, is that there's not actually like a democratic political space for those conflicts to happen. So maybe that's, you know, that's probably a good thing. That we want to have these political fights over in a context where we actually have policy instruments to deal with it. And so hopefully we can sort of come to some more peaceful resolution of the, in my view, kind of inevitable conflict that inequality at some point gives rise to. So I think that's why I find it useful not to think about it so much in terms of like these parallel forces, but actually as this kind of counterfactual, where what does a world look like if you in fact have inequality and don't have government policy tools to kind of to do something about it. It looks much more like the Gilded Age than it does today. And so what that might mean about today is that the places where you see kind of the manifestation of conflicts over inequality are less in terms of like big homestead strikes and armed militias and lynchings, but much more in the space of conflicts over ideas, over cultural production, and so because we're trying to win in the game of and over funding of politics and you know whose votes and whose political voice counts for more. So that's, I think, where it kind of means that we kind of have to take account of the fact that the political fights induced by that inequality are going to manifest in a very different way today than they did in the 19th century.
Paul, let me ask you to pick up on this question about the role of government and inequality. In the contemporary discussion about inequality, as I think everyone here knows, there's sort of 2 conversations about the drivers of high and rising inequality in the rich countries. One focuses on transnational forces, globalization, technology, trade. But others, and I associate you with this, focus much more on national level policies and institutions as the important explanatory factors. So can you talk about this a little bit, the role of national institutions in shaping inequality and contrasting these 2 historical periods?
Oh, wow, yeah. Actually, maybe I can start this with a sort of further addendum to the question you posed to Suresh, because if you want to ask about differences between now and then, it's worth remembering that even leaving aside some of the deeper stuff I want to get to in a minute, well, I'm not sure, but that even the United States, even though we, you know, if you're a center-left type person, you complain that we don't do enough and that we're not doing enough to fight inequality, and you worry about all of that. We do have a substantial tax and transfer state that certainly does quite a lot to limit some of the extremes. The 1% pays on average between 35 and 40% of its income once you include state and local taxes in taxes. That's many of us think that should be higher, but that's not trivial. The transfer state does provide food stamps, health care, various kinds of income supports to a large number of people. So that's a huge difference. Even so, when you have pre-tax income inequality right now looks comparable to what it was basically at the earliest moments we can measure it, which is around 1913 or so. But post-tax and transfer inequality is substantially less, and particularly I think the social, as somebody said, if we actually look, sorry, a bit of a diversion, the unemployment rate in 2010 was around 9% in the U.S. As best we can tell, if you measured it by modern standards, the unemployment rate in 1936 was also around 9%. Now, there's been substantial recovery from the depths of the Great Depression, but it was still, we still consider that to be squarely in the middle of the Great Depression. So people ask, well, where were the tent cities? Where were the soup kitchens? And the answer, in large part, is that food stamps are the soup kitchens of the 21st century. So that really makes a big difference. Now, yes, I think the Gilded Age gives us maybe that segues right into it. We have, in the modern world, we have institutions that limit market-based inequality. We have both the tax and transfer state and minimum wage laws. If sitting here in America, we say, well, unions are no longer an important factor, but that's a uniquely American phenomenon. If you were in Denmark, 2/3 of the workforce is still unionized. So in many ways, the comparison between the Gilded Age and now is if market forces seem to be wanting to produce similar levels of inequality, how much can that be limited by institutions? And all of these institutions are things that were, mostly they were invented during the Gilded Age. Progressive taxation was sort of an invention of the progressive movement in the U.S. The welfare state was kind of invented by Bismarck, but they were small. They were relatively unimportant back then. They're major even here now, and yeah. So in a way, I would say that the differences between now and then reinforce a point that cross-national comparisons say right now, which is that there's a lot of political decisions can make, and institutional choices can make a huge difference to the kind of society you have, even if you face similar global economic forces.
Thank you. So, Devin, let me ask you, I'm going to ask a historical question, asking you to comment on the sweep of an entire century bounded by these two periods. I happen to be holding in my hand something that I'm sure everyone in the room here has seen. I'll just hold it up, but it's the famous picture of the U shape of inequality peaking in the early part of the 20th century, falling to a U, obviously the Great Compression, and rising. So this U is now really very, very well known. This particular picture is the top 1%. It's the same picture in many other measures. So the question, Devin, is can you talk about this arc? I think we've talked already about what caused the very high level of inequality. We're not finished that conversation, but why did it subside? And why did it then reverse itself and rise again? Have the goals of equality and democratic capitalism collapsed in this country? How do you see this large sweep of time?
Sure. I mean, I see it, largely coming, rise of, the crisis of democratic capitalism, when I use that language, at least through the rise of things like a protectionist sort of legislation in the late part of the 19th century. Here I'm talking about tariffs, which gets back to the question of global competitors. And so you see a rise of tariffs. See the rise of tariffs in the U.S. In the late part of the 19th century, in many ways to push back against foreign competitors. But with the tariffs comes an increase of trust, right? A rise of monopolies and trust. And so if you look at it, wherever there are the highest tariffs, sugar, the meat industry, farming machinery, as well as steel, you also see the increasing likelihood of trust in the U.S., monopolies in the U.S. And these trusts do a couple of things. They stifle innovation. They also produce less worthy products. And then they also wound up, again, pushing back against competitors. And so these tariffs and these trusts end up, again, exacerbating inequality in the U.S. And it's something I think both Paul Suresh sort of mentioned too, the absence of federal taxation. We get the first federal income tax in the 19-teens. And so before that, most of federal revenue, I think roughly 90%, if not more, of federal revenue came from the tariffs. And so taxes are a way in which to transfer sort of wealth in a society. That was not happening prior to the federal income tax, at least at the federal level. It was happening at the state and local level, and particularly in places like the U.S. South, where majority of African Americans, people of color, sort of lived in the 19th century. And so you have regressive taxation at the state and local level, particularly through means of sales taxes. So absence of any property tax in the South. You have with rise of sales tax, again, which are, again, exacerbate inequalities. And so what happens in the early part of the 20th century, and this gets, I think, to Roseanne's point about the progressive period, is you get first the Roosevelt administration and then the Wilson administration really pushing back against the rise of tariffs and trying to roll back tariffs. And then you get things like the, again, federal legislation pushing back also against the rise of trust. The Antitrust Act was somewhat useful, but it left a lot of holes, particularly against sort of smallish or mid-sized sort of monopolies. And so the Wilson administration comes in a bit later to, again, push back against the rise of trust. And so rolling back tariffs, pushing back against the trust, as again, the Wilson administration sort of does. And the third thing is again, the federal taxation policy, which, again, the administration had to do once it lost so much of its revenue by rolling back tariffs. And so then you get the rise of a federal income tax, which really does help to sort of close the wealth gap, or at least I should say close the inequality gap, I should say. Wealth is might be a bit different. We could also look to things like regulatory capture. I think Roseanne may have mentioned Interstate sort of Commerce Commission. There was a joke that Commerce Commission basically was sort of run by the railroad executives, railroad industry, right? And so, but at least the regulatory architecture was there. And what happens in the latter part under the Wilson administration is that he actually breathed life into it. They also breathed life into the regulatory architecture if you look at the Federal Reserve Board. They actually sort of kind of win the argument against the financiers of the age and era who wanted to have one central Federal Reserve. They pushed back and were able to get 12 regional boards across the country, which kind of sort of decentralized sort of power to some level. So the Federal Reserve Board, the Interstate Commerce Clause breathing more life into it. And then I would also push and argue about the Federal Trade Commission, which helps to roll back abuse of consumers and predatory products and predatory pricing, or the FTC. And I think those are the factors, as well as the federal income tax, which help to sort of close the inequality gap a little bit. And I would sort of say one other thing. So much of inequality that we experience is not simply material and measurable and in a sort of quantitative sense, is also psychic. In another way, which the Wilson administration sort of helps to at least psychically sort of close that gap, and concerns about financial precarity is through things like segregation policy. And so under the Wilson administration, Washington, D.C. resegregates federal offices. It was not Wilson's position per se, but he was following the dictates and leads of basically people like the Postmaster General, Treasury Secretary, and others who believed that segregating offices and segregating employment in D.C. was important. As he argued that you don't want basically a white person working under an African American. So it provided a level of psychic sort of value against the sense of white racial precarity in the South, in addition to all these policy and regulatory policy sort of mechanisms and measures that existed. So it's a combination of factors, I'd argue.
Okay, there was a lot there, mostly talking about the decreasing inequality. I'm sure we'll come back in detail to the U-turn. Roseanne, let me ask you to pick up on something that we've heard about now, I think from everybody, a theme that we all associate with the first Gilded Age is that of trusts and monopolies and so-called very big corporations, which we know rose between 1895, I think especially in 1905. So a slightly multi-part question here. Not everyone agreed on, first of all, which organizations were trusts and which were not, so maybe you can give us a little lesson on that. And nor was there agreement on whether trusts were always bad or harmful. Nevertheless, the trust question was one of the great questions of the day. So today, as you and others have noted, trusts are larger than they were in the first Gilded Age, but we don't have a robust movement to control them. So some would argue. So what might the trust question of the first Gilded Age tell us about the current relationship now between very big business and the people and the state?
Very big question. So first of all, trusts. The word trust or monopoly often gets used quite loosely in the first. Oh, my mic. I'm doing very badly with my mic here. Trust and monopoly are used interchangeably in the first Gilded Age, and they're and not necessarily to mean something that is technically a monopoly, and usually these things are not technically trusts in the legal sense. It basically means a very large entity that is causing problems probably to me and maybe also to you. So it's a somewhat fluid term, but everyone talks about the trusts and monopolies as sort of synonymous problems, and everyone agrees they are a problem, though what the problem is and what they actually are two different things. Some trusts definitely hurt people. They, especially the railroads, there's natural monopolies, hurt farmers in particular, particularly in the Midwest in the through the whole period, but certainly starting in the 1870s. Railroads might also hurt businesses if they were playing favorites, for instance, with Standard Oil. So if you're a petroleum producer and you're not Standard Oil, you're not feeling so fondly towards the Pennsylvania Railroad. Railroads were particularly cruel to farmers, though, because they charged discriminatory rates. So they charged farmers in some places more than they charged industrial producers, and others to haul the same weight, the same distance. And farmers were furious. One thing that's quite useful to know about the trust question and the problem of railroads in the Gilded Age is that people channeled their anger into action. So for farmers, this led to organizations like the Grange, the anti-monopoly movement, no monopolies at all, and the anti-monopoly party. It also led to the so-called Granger cases decided before the Supreme Court in 1877, which affirmed the right of the government to regulate fees charged by common carriers. It helped to lead to the passage of the 1887 Interstate Commerce Act, which may have been run by railroad executives, but in fact did do something to regulate railroads. It also led to the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. There's not just farmers fear the trust. This is a general paranoia. If the labor question is the great question of the Gilded Age, the trust question is the next great question of the Gilded Age. And people feel that trusts, general public, feel that trusts are harmful to democracy. The great image, you may have seen this, of Standard Oil. Standard Oil is the paradigmatic trust. So if you want to evoke trust, you say, like Standard Oil, and everyone goes, ooh. But there's a cartoon you may have seen of Standard Oil as an octopus, and the center of the octopus is a refining tank, and the tentacles are reaching out to strangle Congress. It's heading towards the White House. It has already destroyed or is strangling steel, shipping, and copper, I think, some other industry. But the best part is that the octopus is having fun. It has these like beady little eyes, and it's like, woohoo, the White House. It's like, this is really quite scary. I think that cartoon's in Puck. So what to do about this? There's Sherman. By the late 90s, the Supreme Court was trying to stop all restraint of trade, no matter what. This is the Trans-Missouri case, Addison Pipe and Steel. But large firms increase, as Janet just said, between 1895 and 1905 or so, the merger movement occurs. Companies, corporations, industrial corporations in particular, in the midst of a depression, they conglomerate in order to kind of save themselves. Clearly, very big is not going away. So the question became, for many Americans, was not to get rid of them, but how, this is John Bates Clark, who's an economist, his words, how to domesticate the dinosaurs and turn them into docile draft animals. TR tries it with backroom deals, the Bureau of Corporations. By 1911, the Supreme Court has moved on to the rule of reason. Is it a reasonable restraint of trade or not? It's not for Standard Oil and American Tobacco. So these are questions, like it becomes less a question of big and is it bad for society, not just the consumer. So it's not just Robert Bork's consumer argument, but is it bad for society? Does a company, a corporation, a trust intend monopoly? By 1914, there's the Federal Trade Commission, and popular anxiety about monopolies declines, says Louis Galambos' article from the 60s, even among farmers, because regulation seems to work. Now, whether you think regulation is truly effective or not depends, but people really did feel that trusts had been domesticated and they were controllable, but they remained sitting there rather large. Paul, let me ask you to pick up on,
Can I just chime in on one, actually, I think very interesting parallel, I'm sort of drawing on that, is kind of the role of the courts. Again, kind of like every time there's like progressive legislation at the state level, you know, it moves up in the courts to kind of either hamstring it or strike it down. And so they're really kind of very powerful in being a very reactionary entity in the 19th century. You sort of see that with Lochner, sort of the culmination of that. And so I think that's an also interesting parallels, like the constraints that the judiciary is putting on like the scope for redistribution for policy interventions.
But then the moment at which that expands it, right, with Brandeis and the movement for fair trade. So it contracts under Harlan, but then expands it out under Brandeis.
Let me, Paul, I want to turn to you to stick on this topic of monopoly power, maybe turning to a slightly more economic take on this. Can you talk about monopoly power as a driver of both wealth of earning and income inequality then and now, and also monopsony power, which I know I've heard you talk about as an explanatory factor, especially in wage stagnation in the contemporary period?
Yeah, so, I mean, there are really two questions here, I think. One is, actually, there's the third question, but I don't think we can answer it. The third question would be, can we really compare the extent of monopoly power now with that 120 years ago? And the answer is probably that's a really hard comparison to make. But the first question is monopoly power, in particular, are monopoly rents, sort of excess profits earned because of market power, on the rise? The answer to that seems to be a really clear yes. It's true that we have some problems in actually tracking industrial concentration. Part of the reason for that is that the data, the system of industrial classification we use is really getting long in the tooth. It really doesn't very well correspond to what modern sectors and industries are. So using traditional measures of concentration is problematic, but it does look as if concentration is rising, and there are other subtler things. The ratio of market value of corporations to the cost of reproducing their assets, Tobin's Q. But anyway, that's kind of a measure of how much of their profits derives not from what they, not from the factories and office buildings, whatever that they own, but rather from some kind of monopoly position. And that's been on a pretty steady upward trend for the last several decades. So we really are looking at an economy where monopoly power of one sort or another is on the rise. Probably also, the evidence is shakier, but there's a lot of evidence that monopsony power, ability of employers to affect the wage that they pay, is strong and probably on the rise. And I can go on about that, as Janet knows, at much length. How big a role is it in inequality? Probably quite substantial. It's when you see people. When people talk about the 1%, but really, I think what really people have in mind is more like the 0.1%. People who like to emphasize market forces always end up talking about sporting stars, pop music stars, whatever, as exemplars, but that's actually a tiny fraction of that population. The 0.1% is basically business executives. And those business executives are paid very high levels of compensation, which are very hard to say that those are required by the market. it makes a lot more sense to say that in most cases we're talking about corporations that have some kind of market power, are not actually all that constrained by competition, and that some of those rents can be hijacked by executives at the top. So it is a pretty big factor in particularly in high-end income inequality in the United States.
Thank you. I can't help but add a statistic. Our speaker this morning threw out a few and noted that you could sort of do this all day long, but we recently learned that the top 25 highly paid hedge fund executives, their average annual earnings is $850 million a year. So it's a big number. Suresh, let me ask you to, I'm shifting gears a bit into some themes that are related to social dislocation and related questions. You made some very interesting comments in your initial remarks about violence in the late 19th century. So I want to ask you to tell us a little bit more about that. There were some, of course, important historical forms of violence and episodes, from Native American dispossession to Union repression and Jim Crow. Can you talk about how these shaped the patterns both of economic development and inequality of that period, and maybe contrast that if there's time to today? I did note that you commented that today, rather than these kinds of violent conflicts, we're debating ideas, which I thought was kind of sweet.
Well, it's a pretty dirty fight.
So kind of an optimistic phrase there. Anyway, so talk to us especially about violence then and its power as a driver in the Gilded Age.
Okay, but let me first pick up on something that Paul left under touch. So a big part of my research these days is actually kind of documenting monopsony and kind of its various incarnations. And actually part of this started with a paper on the Gilded Age labor markets, where it was just kind of, let's look in like the most laissez-faire labor market that we can find, and let's see if we can find like so one of the kind of smoking guns for the presence of monopsony is when the sort of similar workers are paid different wages at different firms, because it suggests that like there's not this kind of perfectly competitive market where everyone's getting paid the same wage. And so, and you can kind of do that with the 19th century census of manufacturing data and look at like basically wages as a function of the value added of a company in the 19th century census of manufacturing. And you kind of get, it's really great, like that basically if you're lucky enough to work at like a really productive firm, you're getting a pretty big wage kick, independent of anything about you. And so that's kind of a good, and it's very similar to contemporary estimates of this number. It's called the rent sharing elasticity. And so it's interesting that again, in this like laissez-faire labor market, you've got still kind of pretty, I think, as good as you can get evidence on monopsony in that labor market. Oh, also diversion. I just want to say there's a big hole in our evidence base as economic historians, and I would love to hear from people in the crowd. We actually do not have great measures of either wealth or income inequality between 1870 and 1913. It's this kind of like amazing missing period where basically the census stops asking about wealth in 1870 and the tax data on income doesn't start until 1913. So, and so we kind of, there's a lot of like drawing lines between 1870 and 1913, and we actually don't have any great data. So, a lot of those lines. What? You've drawn a lot of those lines. Yeah, that's embarrassing. That's, okay. So then on to the question. So like I said, I think it's interesting that one of the things about the U.S. is that it's like kind of got what I think we would call in development economics these days. In some dimensions, it's got like kind of a weak state, and particularly in the South, it's got like the apparatus of state, penetration into society is still like not very thorough, and I don't think it becomes really thorough until the New Deal. And so that's why violence in the South looks like vigilante violence. It looks like local, it looks like locally organized violence, sort of managed by local elites and or local non-elites. And so that's I think like interesting because it's part of the U.S. that's looks a lot more like a developing country where the ability of the state to pacify the population just hasn't completely consolidated yet. And then in the North, what I find interesting is how much the institutions of the federal repressive institutions, like think of Pinkertons and the Federal Army, and you know that and they're getting used to both for Native American wars and strike repression. In fact, like the modal use of the Federal Army in the 19th century is to like break a strike, and so that's kind of, and there's very kind of great stories about how like college students are actually like Yale college students are kind of used to break strikes in New Haven, and so it's very violent, and I think that's kind of an interesting way in which, and I would like to know more about the history of like how that initial institutional formation of, for example, the FBI grows out of the Pinkertons, how that initial history of labor repression kind of like sets the character of these repressive institutions for like a long time, and so how much of that does that stick around in how they operate. And so again, and then coming back to the courts, the thing that makes this kind of legitimate is that actually like it was very hard to get local politicians to agree to the use of violence against strikers, for example, because they were electorally accountable. But that's why the courts become such an important institution for legitimizing this and the use of injunctions, where basically you could rely on this kind of the federal Army and not kind of have to rely on the fickle local politician, because you could go to the courts and get an injunction, and then that would be grounds for using the military. So I think, I guess, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Devin, let me ask you to pick up on a theme as Steve Fraser spoke about in his keynote at some length, and I know it's something you've thought about a great deal, and that's the question of race. That you've written a lot, of course, about race and the Black experience. Can you say a little bit more, you've already touched on this, about how race factored in, how it should factor into these conversations about market forces and capitalism and inequality. What is the broad significance of the role that race played in inequality in the first Gilded Age, or in inequality and economic development in the first Gilded Age and in the contemporary period?
Yes, and that's actually an excellent segue to Suresh's sort of point. Just to texture your response just a little bit about the absence of the state in the South. Maybe for some people, there was an absence of the state in the South, but for African Americans, again, 85% of who actually lived in the South, whether the urban or rural South, the state was quite present in many ways, and it was present indirectly, you might sort of say, through fiscal policy, like I mentioned before, a local sales tax, which is the primary way in which they raised revenue in the South, because there was such pushback against property taxes in the South. And the policies of local sales taxes in the South, and the disparate racial impact those sales taxes had on people of color, on poor people generally, but people of color in particular, then basically spreads to places like the Midwest and the West. Rourke O'Brien's book, Taxing the Poor, is a great example of that. And so fiscal policy, again, a way in which wealth gets transferred, is a way in which you see how the state has an impact on race and inequality nationally, but especially in the South. And also the other thing would be residential segregation. The primary way in which the average American builds wealth in society is through property ownership. In the South, they impose residential segregation. Largely, here's an example of where we talk about the Gilded Age, the rise of economic elites and the pushback against the rest. Here's an example of where the economic elites actually lost the sort of battle. Because in the South, the economic elites actually wanted, they opposed actually residential segregation often because they wanted their workers, many of them who were actually people of color, to live close to where they're actually working. There's an excellent book which has come out recently by Betsy Urban Triot on this sort of issue about residential segregation in the South and ways in which economic elites actually lost the battle to working class whites. And for working class whites in the South, they view residential segregation as one of the sort of last lines of psychic defense against the encroachment of people of color. Again, Du Bois talks about the psychic value of whiteness, and that bore itself out most explicitly in residential segregation, which then, obviously, as I mentioned before, is a way in segregation, residential policy and home ownership is a way in which wealth gets built primarily in a free market property economy, especially for the majority population. And so I look at, again, fiscal policy as an example, and then things like residential segregation as another prominent example.
So Rosanne, let me cut back to you with another historical question. Well, I guess they're all historical questions, but aimed at you as a historian of this period. When you and I spoke about this before, you used this phrase that the Gilded Age was an age of questions, all in quotes, the labor question, the trust question, the money question, the Indian question, the woman question. A lot of these, of course, had to do specifically with the social dislocations of that period. So looking forward, or moving forward to today, how have these questions changed when we think of the critical social dislocations or disruptions? What is getting disrupted today, and how is this different from these big questions of the first Gilded Age? Or how are perceptions different, if not in the questions themselves?
This is, for me, a tough question because I like to live in the 19th century. I like to retreat back to my period. I think that one of the things that looking at the first Gilded Age can tell us is to think about when people said question. There's a new book by Holly Case, which I'm going to just tout for all of you, called The Age of Questions. It's European history, strongly in what we now call Eastern Europe, but it looks at this phenomenon of questions in the 19th century. And she has this great line that questions, they're not just questions, but they're problems posed as questions. And so I guess what to think about now is what are the problems today? And one of the problems, obviously, is, as this panel says, inequality. But how do we talk about inequality? I think at the very beginning I had some great note on this, that when we talk about inequality, I think Steve Frazier said this, we're not talking about democracy, right? So what does it mean to say, to worry about economic inequality, but not to worry about the robustness of our democratic life? So these are the kind, I think that the question, well, who do we talk about as having, is being more unequal than other people? So that this inequality thus becomes one of the big problems of today in a different way than it was. It's not the labor question, but it is in fact about inequality, access to economic resources. But I think there are other questions as well. So some people lament the decline of the labor movement. I'm not sure it has declined as much as maybe unions, but labor still, people who work still think about it quite a lot. Generally speaking. But we also think about now, maybe the questions are about other forms of inequality, racial inequality, how that maps onto how patterns of legal discrimination, the carceral state map onto, are related to, but not the same as economic inequality. So I guess one way of thinking about these questions is what are the big problems of today? And to me, it's, I mean, I'm no expert, but I live today. So the questions seem to be economic inequality, racial inequality, related but not the same thing.
Thank you. Paul, I'm going to ask you something about inequality on the high end, and I just want to turn back to something that our keynote speaker said this morning, which I hope I'm going to quote properly, that in the early period we talked more about exploitation, but today the dominant theme is really inequality, and those are somewhat different. Of course, as everyone knows, and we've all talked about it a great deal in the last decade, there's been this enormous increase, at least among elites, in talking about inequality in the United States and many rich countries. And now we have this explosion of regulatory proposals, tax proposals related to wealth and also high income. There's a lot of concern about high income at the top. So that was a long way to say, Paul, something I know I've heard you talk about, and this of course draws on the work of Piketty and Saez. In the old days, in the first Gilded Age, the high income was mostly driven by capital, or by the acquisition of capital. And today, something that, especially in the US, we've learned is a lot of the high-end income now is coming through compensation, through this combination of compensation and capital, which we know are very intertwined. And I think that changes people's perception of how to tackle this. So talk about that a little bit. Is that contrast a good one? And what are the implications as we think about the difference between the two periods and especially about taxation?
Okay, so this is something I'm thinking about a fair bit. So the numbers, And on this, really, our first numbers are from 1916, but we can compare over roughly a century. And again, I think that the 0.1% is a better barometer than the 1%. In 1916, the 0.1% was overwhelmingly deriving its income from ownership of assets. At least that's what the data seemed to say. So half of their income was dividends. Only 10% was compensation. By now, that's roughly reversed. It's actually not fully reversed, about 40%. So actually, people have the notion that it's all high salaries. It's not. It's still it's about 40% is compensation. A fair bit is entrepreneurial income, which is a vague category, but only about 15 or less % is dividends. So it looks like there's a fundamental change in the structure. What I'm not sure about is whether that's real, or how much of it is real. How much of that is a statistical illusion? After all, there are, in the modern system, there are tax disincentives to deliver income to people through dividends. In the 0.1%, an important part of the compensation category is exercise of stock options. How much, to what extent was it the case? And I don't really know the answer to this. And actually, this is where somebody who really knew how to do this kind of research would be helpful. To what extent was, put it this way, when Rockefeller was assembling the Standard Oil Trust, he was acquiring companies, and the previous owners of those companies became executives who shared ownership of Standard Oil, as I understand it. So their income would have been reported as capital income. Today, you have our modern monopoly companies in which people who are also the executives who run companies are receiving stock options. So it's reported as compensation. To what extent is it really the same thing, just under a different name? It's probably some difference, but there's probably not as much of a difference as the way we calculate the numbers tends to suggest. And there've been, the rise of a significant taxation state changes the incentives for how income is reported. And also, just the final point, up until 15 years ago, we used to say, well, the compensation share of income is stable. So this rising inequality is all about increases in compensation inequality. That is no longer true. We have now seen a steady drift towards a lower labor share in national income. So we may be more like the original Gilded Age than we think we are.
Suresh, do you want to add to that? I know you've written about labor markets then and now. You want to talk about the capital income share at the top and anything about taxation?
I mean, I agree with the general point that I think we might have to think about there being kind of this gray area of income that is like capital-ish, and but comes with you having a job title, and so while it looks like you would get it, and I think we need to. Conceptually, we need some work in thinking about like what makes something capital-ish, and it might be something about to what extent is your compensation varying with the profits of the firm. So like bonus pay looks capital-ish, much more so than just kind of the stable base wage that you get. So I think this is all interesting and things to be talked about. The other kind of, I think, interesting rise is also the rise of this again, these tax advantages, like pass-through income just becoming a big part of the capital income share. So think of like your doctors and lawyers that own their own firms. So it's capital income, but it's actually that they're getting paid for working. I'm not sure that it should really matter for how we normatively think about it. I agree that like our intuitions are that if you work for something, if it comes on a W-2, you're more entitled to it than if it comes on comes in as capital income. But it's not if you wanted to sort of ask the deeper question of is it proportional to sacrifice in kind of any way, you would probably be like no. And so I think the same kind of normative criticism you'd have of capital income as being disproportionate to like sacrifices made would kind of stand also for ridiculously high labor incomes.
I would just say, as somebody in the data and measurement business, it's extremely vexing to try to separate the two. But where I think it's being forced upon us now, as we're debating whether we should be taxing income or wealth. That seems to be the big policy question.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, like at the state level, just on your point about the sales taxes, the other thing that the states have, which is very interesting, is that they do have wealth taxes in the 19th century, but they're kind of these Byzantine schemes where there's like a separate tax for like your silver spoons and a separate tax, you know, so they just have these like ridiculous tax schemes, which is why the early economists like Francis Walker and co. were big proponents of moving to the income tax, was that they saw there was so much scope for evasion on those kinds of very specific wealth taxes. And in some ways, the case for the wealth tax today is that we've financialized so much of that, so now there's a much more homogeneous like wealth base that you can kind of tax in a way that you couldn't in the 19th century.
And also corporations in the South actually were heavily taxed, ironically.
By the southern states.
Exactly, yeah.
It is 11:15, so it's time to hear from the audience, which I think we're looking forward to. Please take a spot at the mics, and I'll just do the very simple this and that. Let me ask that everybody identify themselves, and then of course I have to say the requisite. If your question is prefaced by a statement, try to make it shorter than 20 minutes long, if possible. Over here.
Hi, my name is Thomas Lopez Pierre. I'm an affordable housing guy, private equity. My question is for the panelists, but particularly for the two gentlemen on the end, because you spoke about violence. Recently we read that only 7 students got into Stuyvesant High School, and we see that New York City is 50% Black and Hispanic. We see that Rikers Island is 90% Black and Hispanic. We see our economy changing from middle class to very educated or very poor service jobs, where, for instance, we have a Metro card, so we no longer have token clerk Bruce that used to be in Southeast Queens, highly Black and Hispanic. So my question is, with displacement taking place in housing, do you see the Black and Hispanic community resorting to violence as more white people move into our neighborhoods and push us out? Where do we work? Where do we live in the city of New York, and supposedly one of the most liberal? Thank you.
I mean, at some level, yes, the paradox of New York City, yes, it's the most, essentially one of the most liberal city in America, but also it's kind of also sort of racial history. During the Gilded Age, the wealthiest city in America, yet 2 out of 3 of people actually lived in tenement housing. So they always had this sort of tension. So about the resorting to sort of violence question, at this point, no, Obama talked about the sort of the quiet riots that experienced in the city. The late Michael Katz wrote a book, Why Don't American Cities Burn? And the lack of mobilization and movement in these spaces, even in the face of really sort of regressive public and social policy. And so I don't necessarily see any kind of sort of social mobilization in that sense, or a rise in sort of violence. One last thing about the automation and technology thing, which is also a very big issue. We didn't get to it on this panel. A very big issue during the first Gilded Age, in which the rise of technology in various industries, and particularly like farming, but elsewhere, was seen as a way to push back against the rise of mobilization, social movement, and labor organizations. So it's a way in which the kind of private sector sort of undermines mobilization, organizing technology often is.
Suresh, you want to add?
I agree with all that. I do think one thing that's very interesting is kind of that is different from the Gilded Age is kind of the rise of the well-educated liberal and that they're high earners, and that you're seeing this across the Western world, that like basically the old institutional redoubts of the left, like labor parties, even unions, are now increasingly kind of the only people that have them are relatively well-educated people, and the people that are voting for them are and so this is sort of a recent sort of stream of work by Piketty has been sort of documenting this rise of the 2 elite world, where you have like the old-fashioned capitalists, but then you also have these like human capitalists, and the 2 parties are basically catering to one of these 2 groups of elites, and that's kind of you know, and he argues that that's kind of the sort of happening systematically across Western countries. So and New York City might be very emblematic of that.
Yeah, Thomas Frank had the famous, what's the matter with Kansas, about why do working class voters vote for the right wing, and I think it's Andrew Gelman who said the really question, an equally good question is what's the matter with Connecticut? Why are all these high income people voting for liberals?
I think we have a question over here.
Yeah, my name is Rob Hollander. I teach at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. The first Gilded Age, a progressive era. Our Gilded Age, if it is a Gilded Age, it seems to be ending in or continuing with a regressive era. Does that imply to you that things have to get much worse before anything will get better, or will things just sort of chug along in this inequality way?
I'll take one stab at that, which is, I actually think, I mean, I hate the periodization arguments, but, you know, my preferred one would be World War I as the ending point. And that, you know, part of the, so I've got some work with Branko Milanovic and Thomas Howard sort of arguing that, in fact, like globally, it's not clear that the Marxist analysis of World War I was wrong, that actually all of this kind of built up wealth and inequality in like the advanced countries was a contributing factor to this kind of huge cataclysm that hit the Western world. So I think in my read, the Gilded Age ends with World War I. And so I do worry that like the only thing that will put the brakes on the system that we have is some sort of catastrophe that would just really be tragic, but it's kind of the only thing that puts the brakes on kind of the dynamics that we're on. That's me in a depressed mood.
Yeah, so let me be the optimist here for a sec. Or, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, go right ahead.
Sorry. Which is that we shouldn't, I mean, sometimes given the scale of the inequalities and the political victories of people who want to make it bigger can lead you to think that nothing can change. But it is worth remembering that for all of the disappointments, during the Obama years, the average federal taxation rate on the 1% rose sharply. In fact, as far as we can tell, on average, we're back to about the same. We got back up to about the same average tax rate on the 1% that we'd had before Ronald Reagan. So we're really back to 1979 taxes between various changes, including the extra taxes that pay for Obamacare. And we had the biggest expansion of the social safety net since Medicare. So it's not as if redistributionist policies never happen. What's happened so far may be, inadequate to what many people would like to see, but we might be looking back 5 years from now, after after the first term of the Sanders administration, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez such as Treasury Secretary, and the thing might look very different.
Roseanne.
I think it's also to piggyback onto what both Paul and Suresh have said. Sorry, I need like a prod. Yeah, I know, but see, I'm also sliding around in the chair. I think this is part of the problem. Okay, what historians call the progressive era seems like a sort of outpouring of reform all of a sudden on January 3rd, I don't pick your date. But that's not really the case. These are reforms that have been worked on, however inadequately or haphazardly or whatever, throughout the late 19th century. Bill Novak, who's a historian of the state in the United States, points out that the administrative state, if we think of the federal state, the welfare state, doesn't emerge suddenly out of nowhere, that states, individual states have been doing this all along. So that some of what we think of as historians of the progressive era, suddenly appears. It doesn't suddenly appear. It's been happening at local and state levels. Both Suresh and Devin have pointed this out all along. And so it's not quite as different as we sometimes make it out to be, we historians.
Over here?
Okay, that's perfect timing, actually. So I'm Naomi Zodi. I'm a postdoc at the Columbia School of Social Work. And so we heard a little bit about farmers organizing against monopolies and the monopoly party. So I wanted to know more about the progressive era social movements and what kind of lessons we can draw for how people organize in relation to the contemporary institutions.
Well, I think one of the lessons is that it's everywhere, right? And this, I mean, it sounds kind of like crazy, but it's the progressive era, what you might want to call the progressive era, is cross-class. Things like the big federal legislation is not the purview only of farmers, only of the working class, or only of corporate liberals, but of everyone working together. Martin Sklar has this great line about revolutions don't happen because of radicals, they happen because of conservatives. Radicals may start them, but ultimately it's conservatives who enact them, for better or worse, but, you know, Teddy Roosevelt, somewhat conservative in his own way. And that social movements happened at the grassroots, through individuals, but they also happen within bureaucracies. But they generally they begin at the state level. Factory inspection starts at the state level. It doesn't start at the national level. So that some of these are sort of spontaneous, but many of them are not. These are networks of people who who work both privately and publicly, often with the somewhat paradoxical support of corporate elites. So the McCormick family, not known for being cuddly to their workers, they shoot them. So they're not the nicest group, but they help support Jane Addams, who does, you know, have a really broad social democratic vision. And her ideas, though locally enacted, get transferred to national programs and national ideas. I don't know, start local, think global. The best I can do.
No.
Anyone else have any better ideas here?
I think there's another question over. Oh, there's a question over here.
Hi, my name is Nina. I worked as a employment litigation paralegal at Johnson & Johnson. Recently, I had to go on a disability, and I was approved. I have received Social Security disability. And it's kind of a rhetorical question, or my monthly payment will be $1,700. My total compensation when I worked at Johnson & Johnson for many years, and I worked at different companies before for over 15 years, was around $100,000. And you know, it's understandable. I cannot survive in New York on $1,700 a month. Is it fair?
Anybody want to address that?
Can I just say that, yeah, I mean, we have from my point of view, a woefully inadequate safety net. I had one of those genteel disputes with David Brooks, which is all that we're allowed to have among Times columnists, where he had a piece about how Canada has actually made dramatic progress in reducing poverty, and talked a lot about community efforts and so on, which is great. And I pointed out, yeah, I'm sure all of that's true, but it's also true that Canadian family benefits are 3 times as high as a share of GDP as family benefits in the U.S. Family benefits basically meaning non-elderly support payments of one form or another, and that I suspect that somehow spending 3 times as much on programs that might alleviate poverty has something to do with why they have less poverty, and that the U.S. is just, we just don't do remotely enough on any kind of humanitarian basis.
In addition, I might just add, we had another event on this very stage not long ago focused on a book called Risking Retirement, which made the point that not only that the social insurance system for people with disabilities and who are older in the U.S. Is not that bad relative to other countries, but what we're doing with private retirement relative to several other countries is very problematic. We know we have huge numbers of Americans with no assets at all, and they're institutional drivers for that, which are very problematic. My slight intervention. Over here?
My question's somewhat related. During the initial Gilded Age, people had places to live. They had family support to some extent. Today's generation, you have the homeless population. people who have the funds can move out of the urban areas because of the computerization that now takes place. So will the homeless population create an activist group when they currently do not have an activist really taking them and moving forward? It relates to the affordable housing issue as well. So there's a dichotomy between where people are able to live, because in the past people had housing, which is the major issue today.
Anybody want to pick up on that?
Some of that housing wasn't so great, I gotta tell you. And a lot of people didn't. So there is a big dislocation there. The late 19th century is there's a series, it's either one giant depression or a series of catastrophic depressions, depending on how you want to look at it. And especially during the 1870s depression, young men they were called hobos, and they traveled around and took odd jobs, and a lot of them they were not welcome in most places because they were transient who knows who, and I mean that was the perception, and a lot of them did very poorly. But also urban housing is pretty bad. Tenements are dreadful. People die of tuberculosis quickly. There's cholera.
Can I just plug the best museum in New York City?
Yes.
The Tenement Museum.
Great.
Yeah.
Waving their arms, who I'm wondering might be connected to that. Are there other questions from the audience? I think I've seen. Want to move over to the mic? I have a few in store in case they're needed, but I suspect there are more questions.
I would just be interested in hearing you address the issue of privatization and how that's affecting the public school system, the prison system, the military, and that's all.
Yes. Who are you? Can you tell us who you are?
My name is Victoria Rosen. I'm just a New York City resident.
Privatization. I think there's a question about outsourcing as well and the fissured workplace, all of this.
I'll just say something that, like, where it's been studied, one of the places that privatization shows up is as a big increase in wealth inequality, because you wind up moving this like national patrimony into someone's private account, and so and then it becomes it winds up showing up as this bigger increase in wealth inequality. I think the question behind this is that just like, has privatization reduced the quality of the services that we're providing? And it's got to be that it's that on average, I think probably the answer is yes, because there's not the usual accountability mechanisms. But that said, I'm Canadian also, and one of the things that always strikes me about the school system in particular is that like there's not actually like that great there's not a public school system in the U.S. There's like the private school system, and then there's the housing market. And so even when you have things that are like that are publicly provided, because the funding systems are so local, you wind up getting like rich people sorting into the good neighborhoods, driving up the real estate prices, and no one. So I think like the solution to privatization isn't necessarily like local public funding. It's kind of much more at state or federal level funding.
Others want to comment on that? I'll just say there was a very important, I think, literature on inequality about the effect of inequality on the middle class. Robert Frank's book, Does Inequality something in the subtitle about harming the middle class, with the argument that as inequality rises, a growing group of people are opting out of the public infrastructure, opting out of the subway system, the public schools, and so forth, and the implications are widespread.
I mean, I'll say a little word trying to connect the two sort of questions. I think in terms of privatization and also housing, I think maybe tax credits or tax rents for rental property owners, not property owners, but for renters, like you have in other places, other states, other countries, and the absence of expanding that home mortgage interest deduction to actual renters, and then also allowing something like that to also be used for one's credit score as well, to improve one's credit score. I think these are minor ways in which you could have bring in renters into the world of finance, the world of credit, and get lower, improved sort of credit score ratings. Yeah.
There's a question over here.
My name is Daniel Ramine. I'm a longtime New Yorker as well, but I originally came from Tennessee. And I wanted to ask about the geographic distribution of income inequity. It seems that now, as opposed to the 19th century, we have whole regions of this country, counties, states, that are bleeding out, that simply are not going to have that many people left, and for whom there possibly is no way to regain economic value in their present situation, in their present geographic location. Mr. Krugman, you especially have written about that, and I wondered if you see that as a difference between the present economic inequality and the 19th century version.
Okay. Actually, I would say it's a big difference between now and the post-war generation, but not so much from the past. We walk through a wooded area in New England right now, and you'll keep on encountering walls in the middle of the woods, because that's not old growth forest, that's new growth forest after people abandoned their farms. So it's not the case that we didn't have declining regions. They tended not to be whole states at the time, but there was a lot of displacement of people. It was basically, it was very difficult for farming in New England to compete with farming in places where the soil wasn't full of rocks. And so that is not a new phenomenon. What is true is that we did have, and in the Gilded Age, however you define it, there was, of course, enormous inequality among states. The South was, in many ways, a third world country. We had among the things that happened during that great post-war generation of equalizing growth, there was a lot of geographical equalization as well. Regional income differentials narrowed dramatically. The New South was on the rise, and along with everything else, things converged. And around 1980, just at the same time that individual income inequality starts to soar again, the regional convergence stalls and goes into reverse. That poor states start becoming poorer relative to rich states again. So this is all part of a process, but it's, in some ways, we're becoming more like the Gilded Age in that dimension rather than less.
About the regional thing, I'm going to sort of say this again. This is less about the Gilded Age, I think, than the period post-civil rights. In the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the working assumption is that the South would mirror the rest of the country. And to some extent, that has been true. There's a book by economist Gavin Wright called Sharing the Prize, where he talks about the ways in which employment gaps have sort of closed, particularly for people of color, and the ways in which the South in general sort of benefit from that. So there has been a sort of closing to some level. The South, in many ways, mirrors the rest of the country. But what wasn't expected, I think was less expected, sort of unimagined, unintended consequences, is that the rest of the country is looking more like the South. That part wasn't expected or assumed. And I talked about the migration of tax policy from the South to the Sun Belt West and to the Midwest as well as the as northern industries try to compete with a non-unionized South, they began to crack down on unions as they try to compete with southern Sun Belts who are providing corporate tax incentives. They too provide corporate tax incentives, which again reduces the revenue for spaces and communities. And so in the aftermath of the civil rights, yes, the South has changed in many ways, but in many ways the rest of the country has changed to mirror the South, and not the best ways, actually.
Can I ask you a question here? Can
No,
I ask?
you cannot.
I cannot. No, to sort of follow up on that, one of many horrible things in the period called redemption, that is when the white bourbon Democrats redeemed, in many quotes, the South from black rule, was that they clawed back on spending on infrastructure. So black legislatures or Reconstruction legislatures, Republican with many African Americans, spent some money. They taxed people, and they spent money on things like schools and roads and other such crazy things. As those get clawed back, the South becomes much less willing to spend on schools for segregated or whatever, or any kind of infrastructure? And does that, how much of that continues to affect the southern states?
Oh, very much so. I mean, you talked about the rolling back of, so imagine this as a society coming out of Civil War. It has no public infrastructure to speak of. It has no public health system. It has no meaningful public education system. That has to be financed and funded. And this is what Reconstruction governments did in the aftermath of the Civil War. It costs money, costs revenue. In the redemption period, they pushed back against it. And so there's an absence of property taxes and the rise of sales tax, these sort of punitive taxes in this sort of Gilded Age sort of period. So in a state like Louisiana, its population, school population actually doubles in the aftermath of Reconstruction, yet its literacy rates decline, right? And state after state, this is a sort of story. And that's the legacy and history of many southern states, and it continues really on to this day, frankly, in many southern states. And again, in the North, I talked about how corporate taxes in the South were really high. They were, and then 20th century comes and they begin to roll back and reduce those corporate taxes, as well as to pass sort of right-to-work laws. Again, trying to compete against, providing sort of labor. So one of the things that sort of makes the U.S. kind of different than, let's say, the UK is that in the U.S. there's a reduction of taxes to try to attract corporate taxes and labor, try to attract workers. In the UK, what they're sort of experiencing is that is an increase of workers in the U.S. as we try to outsource actually labor in the U.S. So increase of workers in the UK from foreign countries as we outsource labor in the U.S. And that's one of the sort of dynamics that makes the U.S. sort of different from the UK in terms of labor markets, and also in terms of immigration too, I'd say. The immigration issue here is very different than the one in the UK. We're worried here about outsourcing labor in many ways. They're concerned about bringing in labor from EU countries, but also non-EU nations as well.
Question over here.
Hi, my name is Stephen Calabria. I'm with the Comedy Cellar. I was hoping you could comment on the point of view amongst many on the left, particularly in liberal enclaves like New York City, who see entrepreneurship and business-mindedness as being inherently evil, and what effect you think this may have on public policy, on job growth in these places, and whether this viewpoint was shared by many in the Gilded Age.
Wow. Who are these people? I really just don't see that at all. Actually, in a way, this was something I meant to, there was one thing that strikes me about, again, periodization is the Gilded Age, or the progressive era, it was that there was a much more willingness to actually be critical of great wealth. Inherently as a bad thing than there is now. What the things that Teddy Roosevelt said about progressive taxation and about it being desirable not just as a way of raising revenue, but as a way of limiting great fortunes, I don't think anyone running, hoping to get the Democratic presidential nomination would dare to say anything that forthright now. So I would say we actually live in an era where even liberals are very kid gloves in their treatment of business. I just don't see this. This is kind of a fantasy, a conservative fantasy about what's going on the left that doesn't have any counterpart in the politics I see.
I'll sort of say this and sort of piggyback on what sort of Paul sort of said. Your question was about the Gilded Age, and the Gilded Age is also a sense of that the elites of that time period had turned their back on notions of Republican values and Republican virtue, which is a sort of a 18th century notion that it's about the greater interests. It's not about conspicuous consumption like Waverly sort of talked about. It's not about opulence or ostentation that you see with the Vanderbilts of that period of time and others. It's about a level of modesty and greater public concern and public interest. And that the Gilded Age signal a death of this notion of small R Republican virtue and Republican value. And for me, that's what I sort of take out of that period in terms of its relationship to wealth.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, thank you. It was in the Woodrow Wilson administration that a decision was made that labor and management would be separated, where management would deal with the growth of industry, and labor would focus on wages, hours, and working conditions. Nothing has changed over this whole period. We seem to be, in this country, we seem to have a very deep opposition to any kind of national planning. Labor never demanded a seat on the board of directors of the industries in which they worked. It's always been curious to me that our attitude toward the difference between labor and management has never evolved over all this time. We have the same attitude toward what management means in the late 19th century as we have today. There really hasn't been any, it seems to me, there hasn't been any evolution in our thinking about that. What do you think about that?
So I can say something about that. So it's actually, I don't necessarily think it's true. I mean, in the immediate post-war period, Walter Reuther asks explicitly for, worker control in various forms, and the car companies are basically like, no. And so I think it's like, it was floated in the US the same way it was floated in lots of Western European countries after World War II. It's just business was just much more intransigent, I think, here, and was just like, no, we'll give you higher wages, fine. We'll index them to inflation, fine. But we are not going to give you control on the shop floor.
I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last word. It's 11:45, and thank you very much to the panel.
Just a quick word, we're going to reconvene back in this room at 1:15, but it is going to be first come, first serve, so we would love for you to join us in the afternoon, but with that proviso.
I was like, let's do it. Like,
close reading,
like, hey.
Hey, it was a good meeting. Same here, Tom. I'll be in touch. Good luck with the IPO, too.
Yeah, I'm having fun. Thank you. That's a good idea.
So you got the gist of my question.
Enjoyed this panel.
What I left out was they're not building anymore. All right.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Oh my goodness.